Good afternoon. Thank you guys for coming. My name is Mark Yee, and I'm an executive board member of Coptic Solidarity. Thank you for coming to the 3rd annual Modern Coptic Martyrs Remembrance Day. A little bit about Coptic Solidarity for those who don't know about the organization. We're an organization dedicated to advocating equal citizenship for the Coptic Christians of Egypt. And what drives us is an injustice that pervades all aspects of a Copt's life. You see this in impunity when perpetrating crimes against Copts, underrepresentation or absence in nearly every governmental sector, state-sponsored educational system, including Al-Azhar, that propagates denigration of Christian and non-Sunni faiths. What do? We primarily serve 2 functions of awareness and advocacy. We're a watchdog over the events in Egypt, and we inform the public and also policymakers about those events. We advocate at a grassroots and quite diplomatic efforts through our conferences to the U.S. government, international governments, and the UN. This is a recent conference that we held that had Lord Alton, a Canadian parliamentarian, a U.S. congressman. So we try to reach out across the seas. What brings us here today is a remembrance of modern Copts who were martyred just for their faith. And we structure our remembrance around the Maspero massacre. For some background about Maspero, in mid-2011, Islamist Salafists demanded that Christian symbols be removed from a Coptic church in Aswan. Reconciliation sessions failed, as they often do, and the Coptic church was demolished by mob rule in October 2011. The governor denied the church existence initially in statements, but changed his statements to say that the church was illegal and thereby destruction by the mob was justified. On October 9th, 2011, thousands of peaceful Christian and Muslim protesters marched from the Shurba neighborhood in Cairo, heading to Maspero, the state-run television building. The demonstrators were attacked by a Muslim fanatic mob that hurled stones at them. And then the army came. And this is what happened then.
Back and forth for about 4 times.
This is the army of a state that attacked its own citizens in peaceful protest. When they appeared on the scene, they attacked them with riot gear, batons, live ammunition, and armored vehicles. In coordination with the army's action, state-run media, contrary to facts on the ground, an independent video of events announced that cops were actually attacking the soldiers. 29 peaceful protesters were killed, more than 300 were injured. In the aftermath, the justice that was rendered was actually 2 low-ranking soldiers were found guilty of misdemeanors, no punishment rendered, and they were still able to serve in the army. As a note, General Sisi was the general at the time, before president. The current situation since 2011 has not improved. As you can see from this map, documented with all the sectarian events that happened by eshhed.org, you can see this happens all across Egypt, in urban areas, in rural areas. There's not one location where this is not a problem. You can see also documented that it's state actors and non-state actors. As Dr. George Girgis, our president, testified to Congress, and he summarize the situation in detail. God, an Egyptian activist. The real danger to Egypt's very existence is not terrorism, but criminal fanaticism against an authentic part of the Egyptian nation and the state's lack of seriousness to prevent it. That thread of criminal fanaticism is why one of our board members, Mehdi Khalil, filed a report with FIFA through Coptic Solidarity, and Ramon Zachary, who is an able Coptic soccer player, can't achieve his dreams of becoming a professional soccer player. There's massive discrimination. That same thread of criminal fanaticism is the reason why a gunman can enter a church in Hawan and kill 10 parishioners who are praying peacefully. We'd like you to get involved. That's what we're asking for. Please visit our website, www.copticsolidarity.org, become a member, help us with our advocacy efforts. We're helping to promote HR 673 right now. There are 53 co-sponsors, and it really is just saying there's an increase in violence against Coptic people in Egypt. Please pressure the government of Egypt to correct this, make anti-discrimination laws and other laws to protect its own citizens. Please donate to our cause. And the reason why we all do this is the faces of persecution. I'm going to leave you with this. Joseph Helmy was beaten to death after his superior officers in the army learned he was a Christian. His family was initially told that Helmy had died of an epileptic seizure, despite no history of seizures. A medical examination of the dead man's body by the hospital reported injuries and death related to criminal assault. No one was charged in connection with the death. We're looking for justice for these people and many others. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. My name is Lindsay Griffin. I'm the Director of Advocacy and Development for Coptic Solidarity. I just want to thank all of you for making the effort to come today. I know it's not always easy to get to Capitol Hill in the middle of the day, and especially thank you to all of our guest speakers for joining us. On this Remembrance Day, I also want to note that we're live streaming this event, so we welcome all of our viewers worldwide. We have many viewers who are watching this event from Egypt as well as all around the world throughout the Middle East. So we think it's an important opportunity to join our hearts and minds together in remembrance of many people who have died in recent time simply for their faith. With that, I'm going to be introducing each of the speakers. I'd like to ask that they come up here to the podium to speak, and then at the end, I'll moderate the question and answer time from the podium, and you all can use the table mics. Our first speaker is a newly appointed commissioner, U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, Mr. Gary Bauer. He currently serves as the president of American Values, a public policy think tank, and was the Washington director of Christians United for Israel Action. He's held several positions in previous administrations. Under Ronald Reagan, he was the Deputy Undersecretary of Education, and Undersecretary of Education 1985, excuse me, to 1987. He's had several positions, but actually the one that I would like to point out is that he has a daughter who's worked on international religious freedom on Capitol Hill for many years, who has been one of the strongest advocates. Many of you all who've worked on these issues know her. And it was a real pleasure to meet her father today and to see that the commitment and the values to religious freedom run in the family. So anyways, thank you so much for being here. Look forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you today, even for such a solemn occasion as the one that we're here for. The issue of the Coptic Christian community in Egypt and how they're treated has been a concern of the International Religious Commission on Religious Liberty from the earliest time of the Commission's work. And I'm happy, having been a new member of the Commission, to be able to continue our emphasis on this issue. Our concern for the safety and security of the Coptic Christian community and for their desire for treatment as equal citizens before the law in Egypt is unwavering. We're here today, first and foremost, to remember the lives lost and the injustices committed during the tragic events on October 9th, 2011, as has been pointed out, not by radical Islamic groups, not by unidentified mobs, but by elements of Egypt's own military, as unbelievable as that sounds. We need to remember the hope that led throngs of Coptic activists to publicly and boldly gather near Maspero in protest of the destruction of a village church in Upper Egypt. Hope that the moment had finally arrived for Copts to be able to openly demand equal participation in Egypt's present and future. We must remember today the procession that took place on that day. Young and old, clergy and lay people, men and women that set out on October 9th, hoping they could drive home their call for religious freedom and inclusion. We must remember today the terrifying moments in which soldiers armed with live ammunition and armored vehicles attacked those peaceful protesters. And when the state media incited further violence by urging people to come into the streets to defend the Egyptian military. We have to remember today the individuals, I believe the number is 28, whose lives were lost, and to remember the tears of the family members that had to identify their bodies. The tragedy that was particularly violent and lethal did not happen in a vacuum. It happened and was predictable because of decades of religious intolerance and structural dehumanization toward the Coptic Christian community. Things that the government often ignored and sadly sometimes had been complicit in. What happened on October 9, 2011 is a result, at least in part, of the Egyptian government's long-standing failure to fully include the Coptic Christian community into modern Egypt's national identity. And so we come here today, 7 years later, to remember those events, but not simply to remember them, because we can't change what happened in the past. We've come here today to talk about what we're going to do in the future. How can we, in Coptic Solidarity and its partners, what can we do now? How can we work to bring about change, to remove the inequalities and injustices that have plagued the Coptic Christian community and other religious minorities in Egypt all these years? How can we help Egypt? How can we encourage the government to follow a path of fulfilling its greatest potential as a nation, in which all of its citizens fully enjoy the right that every human being is born with, the right to follow God, to believe as they see fit? Now, I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that there's been some recent initiatives by the Egyptian governor, led by El-Sisi and other senior members of his administration, to take some modest steps to improve religious freedom conditions. The Commission recognizes the public overtures that President El-Sisi has made toward the Christian community in recent years, appearing alongside Coptic Christian leadership and celebrating of the Christmas Eve Mass for several years in a row. And yes, it's symbolic, but it does suggest or hint at a shift away from the official state-level apathy of past generations. This potential shift is also evident in the Ministry of Education's efforts to revamp its education system and remove extremist passages that encourage hate. As Undersecretary of Education, I can't imagine why any nation would use its education system to encourage its youth to hate other fellow citizens of its country. But we see this around the Middle East often, and we certainly have seen it in Egypt. Further, we recognize that several other recent developments, including Egyptian security forces' prevention of an attempted suicide bomb attack on a church in Koyabaya on August 12th, the confirmation in February of sentencing of a man who murdered a Coptic priest, Father Saman Shahata, in October 2017, and the conviction of Adel Solomon in March 2017 for killing a Coptic shopkeeper in Alexandria. We hope that these developments suggest that there's diminishing room in Egypt's legal system for toleration toward perpetrators of sectarian rhetoric and violence. We also acknowledge the recent naming of Dr. Mana Awad Makalio as governor of Dumyat, celebrating her historic selection not only as Egypt's second, I'm getting some sort of apparently a special alert. Is it just me?
It's a test. It's a test.
A test. The reach of the Egyptian government is strong. So we recognize and we're grateful that Coptic Christian has been named as a governor. She is only Egypt's second female governor and only the fourth appointment of a Coptic governor in the nation's modern history. The lack of Christian representation among the country's senior political and military ranks has long stood as a symbol of the exclusion and marginalization of the Coptic Christian community. Therefore, while we're under no illusion about what appointment means, it's not a paradigm shift. Nonetheless, it's an important first step, and journeys begin with first steps. However, as those of you who are gathered here today and those of you who may be watching in other places around the world, you certainly understand that symbolic moves are important at the national level, but they really don't do that much at the local level to change the daily reality of the life that Coptic Christians have in Egypt. There was a recent incident that began on August 31st in the Minya area village of Dimshal Hashem. A mob attacked Christian homes, injuring several people, as well as looting, destroying a number of those homes in the process. These rioters had reportedly gathered to punish a group of local Christians who had the audacity to gather for prayer in somebody's home, in a village that had no church they could worship in. First, this incident reminds us that if we needed a reminder, that intolerance toward Egyptian Christians is still pervasive. All societies are complex, they're slow to change, especially in a country with 100 million people. But the commission you serve continues to call on the Egyptian government to devote significant resources towards reforming the country's educational system to promote religious tolerance and inclusiveness. Second, this incident reflects the legal climate that so often determines the outcome of anti-Coptic attacks such as this one. Fortunately, we're told local police have detained 19 suspected perpetrators of this event, and perhaps even more importantly, have not detained any of the victims. Unlike in most of these cases, when victims have also faced arrest, adding insult to injury. However, reports have emerged that people in this village now are facing pressure from the Egyptian government to submit to a traditional so-called reconciliation session. These meetings have often been used by local authorities to absolve the perpetrators of religious violence from legal accountability and to spread blame for the violence on the people that the violence has been done against. As the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom has regularly pointed out, impunity for those who engage in intolerant anti-Coptic mob violence have long stood in the way of justice for the victims of such violence, disproportionately harming Christian constituencies and also damaging Egypt's reputation in the area of the rule of law for all of its citizens. We are reiterating as a commission our recommendations to our own government, the U.S. government, to press the Egyptian government to both prosecute perpetrators of sectarian violence through the judicial system and to address incitement to violence and discrimination against disfavored minority religious groups, including by prosecuting the clerics who incite violence against minority religious communities. Finally, as this latest incident in Egypt shows, the use of private property for worship space often happens because there is no church to worship in. In 2016, the Egyptian government passed the church construction law that would address this problem, but it has been painfully slow in implementing the law. We therefore reiterate our call to the U.S. government to urge the Egyptian government to accelerate approvals for the churches that have applied for renovation, reconstruction, and registration under that law. In conclusion, let me say what I hope someday will be obvious all over the world. All men are made in the image of God. And because they are made in the image of God, they have the right to worship God as they see fit. I don't believe any nation can become great without observing that basic human right. Egypt is one of the great civilizations in ancient history. They have a chance to be great again by recognizing the right of every one of its citizens, including Coptic Christians, to worship as their heart and soul tells them to. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Bauer, for that passionate defense of Coptic Christians. One thing I wanted to mention, you talked about the appointment of the two Coptic governors. In the folders outside, we actually have Coptic Solidarity's most recent press release about the appointment of those two governors, putting it within the context of everything else that's happening in Egypt. So I encourage you to pick up those folders and check out the press release. And then also, I appreciated how you talked about the systematic discrimination, that daily discrimination, which is so prevalent in the greater portion of what's happening to Copts, more so than these terrorist attacks. We actually have a document in the folder as well that I'd like to draw your attention to. It's the 44 questions that we drafted for the Egyptian government. And it's a great document that you can review to see the specific ways in which Copts suffer discrimination. So thank you for bringing those issues up. Our next speaker is Robert Nicholson, the founder and executive director of Philos Project. Robert holds a bachelor's in Hebrew Studies from Binghamton University and both a JD and a master's in Middle Eastern history from Syracuse. He's a former U.S. Marine and was also a Tikva Fellow. He founded the Philos Project in 2014. He uses advocacy to spread the vision of a multi-ethnic and multi-religious Middle East based on freedom of rule of law. I understand that you have some very innovative projects and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Lindsay, and thank you everyone for coming. My name is Robert Nicholson, as was said. I'm the executive director and president of the Philos Project. This is the first time I've really engaged with Coptic Solidarity, so thank you for inviting me. It's really an honor to be here on this very special occasion. So I'm going to take a slightly different tack than my friend Gary Bauer and talk really from my position as a Christian and the kind of organization I lead. So Philos is a nonprofit organization that's based in New York City that seeks to promote positive Christian engagement in the Middle East. And people ask me, well, what does that mean? And really it means training a new generation of American Christian leaders to better understand the people and the issues of the Middle East so that they can advance pluralism, freedom, and rule of law in various fields that range from politics and policy to journalism and ministry. We at Philos seek deep engagement, people-to-people engagement, not just policies written on paper here in Washington, but more on that in a minute. As Christians, we care about our brothers and sisters in the Middle East, and because we care about Middle Eastern Christians, we care deeply about the Copts, the largest single Christian community in the region. The Copts are not only, as you know, a large community, they're an ancient community, and for us living in the West, Christians, they are a window into a forgotten world. Many of the young leaders who come through our various programs start out thinking that Copts are just some other Christian denomination. You know, you have your evangelicals, your Catholics, your Orthodox, your Copts. Actually, that's a generous description. Most of them just think they're some kind of Catholic when they first start. And we go out of our way at Philos to explain to them that Coptic isn't just a denominational identity. Coptic is really a civilizational identity. To be Coptic is to belong to an ancient civilization that ruled Egypt for thousands of years before the arrival of the Arabs. And Copts are not just minorities, which is the way they're often described. And to use an American analogy, they're actually something like the Indians of Egypt. Completely different culture that predates the current culture and deserves not only equal rights, which is what every citizen of Egypt deserves, but special recognition as Egypt's indigenous people and special respect. Most Copts, of course, belong to the Coptic Orthodox Church, but Copts also identify as Catholic and evangelical as well. They are a nation, a culture, a civilization, and I always say that if we in the West want to stand in solidarity with our Coptic brothers, we need to understand the significance of who they are. And we at Philos do understand. This is the kind of engagement we seek, deep, relational, rooted in cultural and historical context. And we don't just talk about the Copts, we go to them. Recently, in the last few months, we had an online social media initiative where we were soliciting signatures for a petition for a program we were calling Let Copts Play, which was advocating for equal rights for Coptic Egyptians who were seeking equal representation in the national football teams. Last night I sat in a wonderful event put on by Coptic orphans where I listened to Nermeen Samir describe the horrific murder of her 10-year-old daughter Maggie in El Boutroussaya church bombing of 2016. This past summer, I brought 50 young people to Jordan and Israel as part of our Philos Leadership Institute, where we took them to Al Bishara Coptic Orthodox Church in Amman to hear from local Coptic leaders about the history of their church and the challenges that they face in the region. We also brought on a Coptic fellow at the Philos Project, Mina Abdul Malak, to help advise us on how to develop a long-term plan for strategic engagement between Western Christians and their Coptic brothers and sisters. This past January, I traveled to Sinai to learn more about the persecution and murder that Copts face there at the hands of ISIS. Next week, I will be traveling to Cairo to meet Coptic leaders there to better understand how we, the Philos Project, can promote the kind of people-to-people engagement I'm talking about. So this is the kind of work that we do, bringing Christian young professionals from a variety of denominational and ethnic backgrounds on trips to the Middle East to help them reconnect with the Middle Eastern roots of their faith and understand current issues so they can come back home and advocate for those issues in their local community. In just 4 years of operations, we've already brought 6,000 young Christian leaders to the Middle East, as well as hundreds of Christian leaders who are already in positions of influence. Now we're organizing this massive alumni community at the local level, building Philos chapters in cities around North America and the world. These chapters not only gather to pray and to learn, but also to connect with Coptic and other Eastern Christian communities in the local area to stand in solidarity, raise money for projects, and work together for the benefit of everyone. I often notice that when it comes to this issue and similar issues, everybody wants some kind of silver bullet, a piece of legislation or a policy that will fix the plight of the Copts. But I always say it took us 1,400 years to get in this mess, and it's going to take us some time to get out. And for me, I'm much less interested in being part of a political process than I am with starting a cultural movement. A movement that starts with the power of the gospel, builds upon shared values that flow from the gospel, and bridges the relational gap between East and West so that Christians on both sides can stand together in this moment of crisis. Because you see, Copts are facing an existential crisis in Egypt, but Western Christians, I would say, are facing a crisis as well. It's a different kind of crisis, yes. It's a crisis of identity, a crisis of forgetting of our faith, and forgetting especially where it comes from. I believe that America's struggles in the Middle East have as much to do with rising Islamic identity over there as they do collapsing Christian identity back here. How can we expect to understand the motivations of people of faith if we are not people of faith ourselves? Connecting with Western Christians with Copts isn't just good for the Copts, it's also good for us. We need to rediscover our first love, a love that Copts have demonstrated time and time again, a love that they are willing to die for. And what I'm talking about is nothing less than a renaissance of our shared Judeo-Christian heritage. The path is not easy. We're divided by doctrine, by denomination, we're divided by difference. Some Western Christians seem oblivious to the suffering of the Copts, and even in recent days, some Western Christian leaders seem more interested in forging relationships with Egypt's political leaders than with Egypt's indigenous Christians. As someone who hopes to train and send out hundreds and, God willing, thousands of young Christian leaders to work on these issues, I see it as my job to educate them on the realities that Copts are dealing with every day, to teach them a respect for Coptic culture and history, and also to help them stand with Copts without turning Islam into an enemy that must be castigated at every turn. I disagree with Islam. Of course I do, because I'm a Christian. But I respect Islam as a civilization, as a religion, and more than that, I respect the many millions of Muslims who want Copts and other Middle Eastern Christians to stay in their homeland as active and equal citizens. Those Muslims, many of whom consider themselves to be observant and faithful, are part of the solution, and I think they need to be part of this story. We must pray for prudence, for wisdom, for love, and for discernment as we navigate the thin line between good and evil. But raising up the next generation of Western Christians is not enough for me. Even more important in my mind is helping to empower the next generation of Coptic leaders. I know that I can't change Egypt because I'm not Egyptian. None of the young Western Christians who are part of the Philos Network can change Egypt because they're not Egyptian either. Our job is to identify and empower those young Egyptians who share our values and want to change their society from within. That's what I call real transformation, local, organic, rooted in the language and culture of the country. To that end, Philos is currently creating a new project to empower young Copts through leadership training and immersive experiences that will broaden their horizons, expand their circle of relationships in the West, and help them think clearly about how they can work for positive change inside Egypt. This is an ambitious project, and it will take time to see fruit. But if you're a Christian, you already believe in the ability of the individual, of the small group, of a committed band of people who are bound by a common vision to turn the world upside down. Because that's how Christianity started. 12 guys with a message who are willing to take it to the world on pain of death. I think that's how we're going to see change come for the Copts too. A small number of people living in East and West who are bound by a common vision and willing to take risks in the name of pluralism and peace. Which brings me to the Coptic martyrs. What does it mean to be a martyr? I ask myself that question all the time. What relevance does martyrdom have for us living here in the United States? I can say, in all honesty, that martyrs shame me. Their testimony of following Christ against all odds, against the grain of prevailing culture, even when it means losing everything, shames me. I think of the many thousands, the many hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of Coptic martyrs over the years, and I'm ashamed for us living in the West. I'm ashamed for Christians all over the world who have not yet recognized that the message of Jesus Christ is one that entails suffering. We need suffering, but not just suffering for its own sake. We're not masochists. We want suffering that counts. Martyrdom really means suffering for a cause, for a vision, for a message. And what is our message? Who are our martyrs today? What are they dying for? We see hordes of martyrs willing to die for an interpretation of Islam that promotes tyranny, misogyny, bigotry, and supremacy. But who are our martyrs? Where are they? Who among us is willing to die, and not just die passively, accidentally, but actively for the opposite message? Who of us is willing to emulate those martyrs of the past and stand up to lead when surrounding culture is against us? And who of us is willing to do so in the spirit of love rather than spite? May the testimony of our Coptic fathers and mothers stand witness before us, both Christians in the East and in the West. May we see in their lives not just a passive resignation to death, but an active desire to change their societies with a new vision, a vision that will draw all those who are waiting for change, that will rally them under a common message, and that will push back against the culture of death that holds so many people in its grip. This active desire to change things sometimes means death. But if death is coming, why not work hard to ensure that death is as meaningful as possible? The question isn't whether there will be more martyrs. There will be. The question is what those martyrs will die for and how impactful their deaths will be. At the Philos Project, we're training our young leaders to ask that question and to build bridges between those in the Middle East who are sharing our values and asking that question as well. We're at the beginning of a long road, this reconciliation between East and West, but I do truly believe that this work will transform both for the better and in the spirit of the kingdom of God. That's why I'm here today. That's why I stand not only with Copts and Coptic Solidarity, but with all those individuals and organizations who share this vision and are prepared to pursue it with the zeal of a martyr. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robert. It's often at these events we hear what all the problems are that we're dealing with. Sometimes we hear recommendations, but to hear the things that you're actually already doing to solve these problems, person to person, that's actually very encouraging and incredible. Our next speaker is Dr. Jonathan Adley. He writes and produces the History of the Cops podcast, which is a weekly narrative series on the history of the Cops, and it's written from a geopolitical perspective. He's a clinical pharmacist by training and is based in Delaware. Age 15, he immigrated to the U.S. with his family. He is a proud Coptic American husband and father. He also spoke at our annual conference in June, and I have to say, some of the things that he shared were very encouraging, and I think really moved a lot of people because, as many of you are aware, in the Coptic community, a lot of our second generation and younger Copts aren't that engaged. But Jonathan, having immigrated when he was 15, he really has a unique perspective, so I hope you'll enjoy his presentation.
Good afternoon, everybody. Before I start, let me express my thanks and gratitude for being invited to talk with such distinguished speakers in front of you, an honor which truly I do not deserve. I am here today not as an expert to tell you about some hard statistics or count the truly countless persecution events against the Copts. I suspect many of you have heard them before, or at the very least, you have a general idea about what the Copts are facing today. I'm here simply to speak to you as a father about his daughter. I have a 2-year-old daughter. Her name is Joy. She woke me up this morning before she goes to daycare to say good morning. This didn't work. Yep, that's her. This is Lucinda. Just like Joy, she was a vibrant, active 2-year-old who was full of life. She filled the life of her family with happiness and joy. A little bit more than a year ago, on Palm Sunday, she woke up very excited. You see, Palm Sunday is a big deal, especially if you are 2. You get to wear your best clothes, you get to see all your friends at church, and above all, you get to have all kinds of exciting toys made of palm trees. You can get a cross, you can get a donkey, and if you are lucky, you can get a crown. On that day, Lucinda went to church, just as Joy did. Joy got to go back and play with her toys, but Lucinda never did. I'm sorry about the graphic images. I wish I could speak about Coptic martyrs as some distant object to be analyzed and then hope and pray for them. I just can't. I am a father, and just like Joy, Lucinda is my daughter. Not in the strict meaning of the word, of course, but in every other sense. Lucinda was a victim of the Palm Sunday bombing in Alexandria. She was one of about 45 other innocent victims. A few months before them, 10-year-old Maggie was a victim of another church bombing, with 28 victims. The list would literally go on forever. I'm not here to list all the martyrs, or even mourn their memories. After all, I believe that they are with the Heavenly Father. I am here to do my best to make sure no such tragedy ever happens again. To use whatever gifts that the Almighty God have given me to make this world a more just and a moral place. Where we stand today was built on the shoulders of a group of extraordinary men who founded this great country. They told the world how governments ought to be. They said that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That is, to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. Let me repeat the words of the Declaration of Independence. The primary function of any government is to protect the life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness of its citizen. That is my perspective as a Coptic American who is truly inspired by this country, yet still wants to advocate for and protect my family in Egypt. By this standard, the situation of the Copts in Egypt leaves a lot to be desired, and it is both our duty and our right to bring light to these issues and do our best to improve them. Now, this is only my perspective. It is not, nor it should be, the only perspective. A different perspective that we heard is the biblical command, fear God and honor the king. Another one might be, Egypt is best left to those who live in Egypt, and any advocacy is going to do more harm than good. Of course, I and we can fundamentally disagree with both perspectives. El-Sisi is not a divine monarch, and international norms in respect to human rights are the crowning achievement of the modern era. But I can see where they're coming from, and will never directly or indirectly attack fellow Copts for following their values. Facts, persuasion, and talking to each other respectfully, in my humble opinion, is the only way to go. We must, and I repeat, must build each other up, not tear down. So what do you do when you disagree and want the international community and fellow Copts to see things as they are in Egypt? Well, I believe that we should present the facts as they are and make a persuasive case for what should be done, respectfully and to build up both the Coptic community and Egypt as a whole. So here are some basic facts. 1. American Copts wish to see Egypt as a modern and a strong nation state that is a strong ally of the United States and leading a stable, prosperous Middle East. This is what is best for Egypt, this is what is best for the Copts, and this is what is best for America. A broken tribal Egypt is bad for everybody. 2. The moral foundation of any modern state are the application of the rule of law, full equality among citizens, and freedom of worship. These are not some unrealistic aspiration to be aimed for over several generations. No, these are the basic foundation that should and could be achieved tomorrow if the political will is there. 3. The extremist mob is not the same as the Egyptian government. True, but both in a direct and indirect way, the Egyptian government and its institution encourage and fail to suppress that mob. 4. There is historic political and social marginalization of the Copts, which goes back over 1,000 years. Minimizing that historic tragedy is unacceptable. It should be both acknowledged and fixed, not covered up and forgotten about. What I am respectfully calling for is for Egypt, with the encouragement of the international community and the supports of the Copts as a whole, is the following. 1. The application of the full force of law for those who attack the Copts under the cover of religious feelings. Let us remember here that not too long ago, a mob dragged a 70-year-old woman naked in the street and got it on video, and the government failed to persecute even a single person. 2. The application of the same laws on all citizens, regardless of their religion. What is legal and illegal should be the same for all Egyptians, regardless of whether they are Copts or Muslims. 3. The complete removal and outright banning of government-sponsored reconciliation councils that subvert the rule of law and serves as a vehicle to protect the extremist elements of the Egyptian society. 4. The reversal of the current oppressive church building law, where churches are seen as some huge national security threat rather than houses of worship for your own citizen. What it takes to build a mosque should be exactly the same as what it takes to build a church. To end, I would like to quote a historical exchange that happened close to 100 years ago, in the events leading to the only Coptic Congress, which happened in Asyut in March 1911. Pope Cyril V sent a telegram to the Bishop of Asyut, saying, "While it gives us great pleasure to see that a number of Copts have agreed to work together for the welfare of the community at large, we would ask our beloved children to refrain from building up a huge gathering in Asyut, which could result in agitation and render them liable to criticism. We would therefore urge everybody to exercise extreme prudence, wisdom, and circumspection." To which Bishop Macarius of Asyut replied to by saying, "With all respect and obedience to your holiness, I would assure you that there is no cause for concern. No personal or public damage is likely to result. The main objective of the Congress being the forging of stronger ties among all Egyptians, through the safeguarding of the legitimate rights of the Copts. I do not feel the slightest apprehension of its being held in Asyut." Like Bishop Macarius, I would like to assure all those attending in person and through social media, with all respect and obedience, I am here to speak for Lucinda, to safeguard the legitimate rights of the Copts, rights that are given to them by the Creator, not by a man-made government, rights that no public or personal damage could ever result for advocating for them, rights that if left neglected will soon be forgotten. Thank you for your time, and please keep the parents of Lucinda in your prayers.
Thank you, Jonathan. That was a moving testimony. Our next speaker is Neil Hicks. Neil has worked for a major independent non-governmental human rights organization focused on the Middle East and more broadly throughout the Middle East for over 35 years. He is currently with the Cairo Institute for Human Rights Studies, which issues some of the best reporting and information that we have on the situation in Egypt right now. He joined the Cairo Institute very recently after 27 years with Human Rights First, where he served as a director of the Human Rights Defenders Program and director of Human Rights Promotion. Prior to that, he was also a researcher for Amnesty International in London between 1985 and 1991. So Neil comes with vast expertise, and we look forward to what you have to share with us.
Thank you, Lindsay. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm not an Egyptian, but I am here representing an Egyptian organisation, and the Cairo Institute is proud to be able to stand in solidarity today with the Coptic community in Egypt and with Coptic solidarity. So thank you very much for the invitation. Of the many tumultuous events in the months and years after the revolutionary uprising in February 2011, the Maspero massacre of Christian protesters was one of the most revealing of the methods and tactics of Egypt's military rulers that they have employed to crush the democratic aspirations of millions of Egyptians, Muslims and Christians, who rose up to overthrow a 30-year Mubarak dictatorship. It was revealing in several ways. First, in its brutality. Mass killings of protesters has become common under President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, epitomised by the Rabat massacre of August 2013, when over 800 protesters were killed and thousands injured in just one day. Other brutal methods now common in Egypt include enforced disappearances, widespread torture, extrajudicial killings, death sentences imposed after unfair trials, detention of tens of thousands of political prisoners without access to due process of law. The imposition of military dictatorship has brought an unprecedented level of state violence, and I'd stress the word unprecedented Lindsay mentioned I've been working on human rights in Egypt for a long time, more than 30 years. And this is by far the worst human rights situation I've ever personally dealt with. And it's really an uncommon event in Egypt's modern history, and we should contemplate the impact of the level of violence we're seeing today. The second way the Maspero massacre was revealing was the way it showed the authorities exploiting and provoking sectarian divisions between the Muslim majority community and the Christian minority as a deliberate policy choice designed to incite violence from the majority population against the minority. Infamously, as we have heard, while the military was forcefully dispersing Christian demonstrators in central Cairo, state-controlled television broadcast false news that Christians were attacking the military and urging Muslim citizens to come out into the street to confront the Christians. And this incitement to violence did not come out of nowhere. It was only effective because the state had condoned and encouraged decades of anti-Christian defamatory propaganda in state-controlled media and private broadcasting services emanating from Saudi Arabia and other states that propagate intolerant, discriminatory, hateful religious ideologies throughout the region and the world. In 2011, the Egyptian military knew that it was addressing an audience that was disposed to believe wild stories about Christians. An audience that had been softened up by years of propaganda, messaging spreading the idea that Christians were suspicious and not real Egyptians. Another sectarian aspect of the massacre was the state's collusion with Salafi Muslim extremists. The state's failure to protect Copts in Upper Egypt from Salafi violence in Aswan Governorate, leading to the demolition of a church the day before the protests, have been a spark. Salafi extremists attacked the Cairo protesters while the security forces stood by and let it happen before the military moved in to disperse the protests brutally. Authoritarian rulers, like the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, the SCAF, as they were called, of 2011, and President al-Sisi's government today, find Islamic extremists useful. They force vulnerable minority communities, like Egypt's Christians, to turn to the state for protection. And they also provide the government with a pretext to deny basic political freedoms and permit a wide-ranging crackdown on all kinds of dissent and peaceful political opposition. Authoritarians have no motive to effectively combat violent extremism. They benefit too much from the climate of fear created by the threat of terrorism and extremist violence. Security policies that are overly focused on military force, repression, denial of human rights, have a tendency to fuel grievances, exploited by extremist groups creating cycles of violence between state security forces and violent extremists. And these cycles become self-perpetuating. When governments stifle peaceful dissent, muzzle the media, prevent the legitimate activities of non-violent civil society organisations, like my own organisation, and restrict religious freedom, they are not enhancing security, they are undermining it. Violating human rights and denying basic freedoms in the name of national security is counterproductive. Like several of you here, this morning I attended the Coptic Orphans event, and I was very impressed to hear about one of the programs they are running in Egypt at the moment, if I get the name right, the Valuable Girls Project, VGP project, where they are bringing together young Muslim and Christian girls and through a mentorship program, teaching them values of tolerance and mutual understanding. And I think back a few years ago when the Cairo Institute was still based in Cairo, one of the things that the Cairo Institute used to do was to have youth projects throughout the country, in governorates throughout Egypt, bringing together youth from all different backgrounds, Egyptian youth from all different backgrounds, Christians and Muslims, and doing human rights education, including values of tolerance and religious freedom. All of those programs no longer take place in Egypt. One of the consequences of the disruption of the work of civil society organizations like the Cairo Institute is that that kind of education of youth, bringing people together, fostering mutual understanding, has been interrupted. Authoritarian governments portray themselves as the protectors of vulnerable minorities from violent extremist movements. But by characterizing even non-violent critics and political opponents as violent extremists, they worsen polarization. Repression in the name of protecting religious minorities produces resentment among the majority population. The minorities, however undeservingly, become identified with and therefore get some of the blame for the excesses of the state. Islamist extremist groups with a declared agenda of fomenting sectarian division in Egypt have carried out some of the worst attacks on Christians in recent years. But ISIS and other terrorist groups have been able to take advantage of the already existing sectarian divisions within the society. Many of the hundreds of attacks on Christians and Christian property in recent years were carried out not by terrorist groups, but as a result of these sectarian tensions. Disfavored religious minorities like Coptic Christians in Egypt are vulnerable to deprivation of their rights from the state and from non-state actors. This vulnerability is heightened, and they are made more insecure when other safeguards like the free press, the rule of law, the free functioning of independent civil society organizations are strained and under attack as they are today in Egypt. Even the ability of groups outside the country to provide support to vulnerable religious minorities is weakened by these attacks. One challenge is gathering accurate information about incidents of persecution. Without such information, it is easy for the Egyptian authorities to dismiss concerns that may be brought to their attention. Clearly, a free press and independent civil society organizations able to report freely and accurately on issues that the government may wish to hide are essential to protecting and advancing the rights of vulnerable religious minorities. It is a positive thing that the current administration, the Trump administration here in the United States, is giving such attention to promoting a core human rights issue like religious freedom. But there is a contradiction. The administration prefers close cooperation with authoritarian leaders in its security relationships in the region, including with President al-Sisi. And it tends to de-emphasize the need for US partners to end violations and extend human rights protections as an integral part of shared efforts to enhance regional and international security. The US government doesn't have a magic wand it can wave to bring a halt to abuses of human rights in other countries. Even a robust relationship provides the United States with limited leverage over its partners' behavior. But the United States can do much more to confront violators, and perhaps even more importantly, to reinforce the link between human rights, including religious freedom, and security. Crackdowns on political dissent and diminishing space for political freedom reinforce extremist narratives and directly contribute to radicalization and insecurity. Respect for religious freedom is an essential part of advancing security. The extremist discourse of some religious institutions is part of the problem. And to be an effective counterweight to extremist discourse, religious institutions must be and must be seen to be independent of state control. Governments can advance security by ensuring that diverse religious views are not only tolerated, but encouraged. Closing space for civil society and peaceful political activities facilitates the expansion of violent extremism and endangers vulnerable communities. Conversely, respecting fundamental freedoms, especially the freedom of assembly and association, is one of the most important defence mechanisms against it. Thank you.
Thank you, Neil. I think something that you raised, that you've been working on Egypt for nearly 35 years, and that the situation right now is the worst that you've seen it, is not something that a lot of people are hearing. And I hope we'll dig into this a little bit in the question and answer time, but I really see it's a battle of narratives right now. It's a battle of the narrative of the Egyptian government that persecution is coming directly from foreign terrorists versus that it's a systematic discrimination that the Egyptian government has allowed and actually perpetuates with impunity. So hopefully we'll dive into that more later. Our last speaker is Cliff Smith. He is Middle East Forum's liaison to decision makers and opinion leaders in Washington, D.C. He holds his bachelor's from Washington State University, an MPP with a focus on international relations from Pepperdine, and a law degree from Catholic University. He's an experienced political operative. He's a veteran of numerous campaigns and has held several positions in Congress, most recently communications director for Congressman Gary Palmer. And if you spend much time on Capitol Hill, you will see Cliff up here constantly being in touch with members, doing incredibly good work. So we're happy to have you with us today, Cliff.
Hello. Let me begin with a qualifier. While I'm an observer of Middle Eastern affairs and try to be knowledgeable as one who works with Middle Eastern affairs on a daily basis, I myself am not an expert on Egypt, Coptic Christians, or any other related topic, really. I think I can discuss them intelligently, but my remarks should be taken as an observant amateur who deals with such topics, but is not nearly as well versed as some of my panelists. My job at Middle East Forum, as she mentioned, is to be a liaison to Congress, to administration, other opinion leaders around Washington. And I do try to follow politics of the world. I do know a little bit how international politics works. What I'm hoping to discuss briefly is the threat to Coptic Christians in Egypt and how American politics, and thus in America, might make a difference. In my view, the threat to Coptic Christians in Egypt comes primarily from an intolerant, illiberal strain of Islam, often known as radical Islam or Islamism. This form of Islam does not represent all Muslims, nor are such interpretations of Islam inevitable, and it also threatens other Muslims, which radicals do not view as true Muslims. However, the threat is disproportionate to Christians. This is especially true in Egypt. While this form of Islam finds its roots in Islam, it is not inevitable. And as a minority in Egypt, Coptic Christians must make allies with Muslims in Egypt if they're to secure their rights and protect themselves from harm. In my admittedly limited reading of Coptic history in the past 1,000 years, Copts' plight has diminished when more moderate Islamic leaders have held power, and increased when more radical theocratic Islamist leaders have power. This brings us to a controversial topic, namely current President El-Sisi. To start off this conversation, let me reiterate a conversation I had with a friend concerning another leader in another country. I opined that Prince Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia, the reformist prince of Saudi Arabia, who has made some strides to modernize this country, would either wind up as one of the greatest leaders in Arabian history, or wind up with a bullet in the back of his head. My friend opined that it was possible he could be both a great leader and someone who wound up with a bullet in the back of his head. And he cited the late Egyptian president Anwar Sadat, who famously made peace with Israel and later died in a hail of assassins' bullets. I recognize this is an imperfect example to bring up. I am not unaware of most Copts' problems with President Sadat, nor the lack of attention he gave to this issue or even persecution he did himself. However, the boldness of making peace with Israel cannot be reasonably denied. And I think it illustrates a larger point. Radical Islamist movements, such as the Muslim Brotherhood and various Salafist groups, can and do threaten non-radical Islamist leaders in Egypt. Any attempt to treat religious minorities with greater respect to promote their interests carries real risks, even to their very lives. Sisi knows this. In fact, a friend I know that has met with him personally described what he viewed as Sisi's obsession with his own personal security as being one of his primary concerns. As you know, President Sisi came to power through a coup against former President Mohamed Morsi, who at least ostensibly was democratically elected. There were, however, numerous, widely unreported, sadly, instances of electoral corruption and a problematic process from the get-go. But, as President Trump said of Sisi, with his characteristic bombast, he took control of Egypt. He really took control of it. Of course, in the aftermath of the coup, the Brotherhood supporters specifically targeted churches, which Sisi's government imperfectly, at least made some efforts to stop, and later at least made some efforts to try to repair those churches. Since then, Sisi has relentlessly cracked down on the Muslim Brotherhood. His main opponent for power in Egypt. He has done much less to crack down on Salafists and others that also threaten Coptic Christian lives. Nonetheless, he's been reasonably popular in Egypt, where the Muslim Brotherhood grew to be hated during their short reign, and increasingly accepted as legitimate internationally, particularly as President Trump gave Sisi a big hug, granting him a legitimacy for a close relationship, which was denied to him by President Obama. Sisi remains a controversial figure in Coptic circles. Pope Tadaros, for example, supported the coup against Morsi. However, Coptic Bishop Marcarius, head of the Coptic diocese in Mina, south of Cairo, he in reinstituting an emergency law that was the hallmark of many of the abuses of human rights that took place under Mubarak's reign, as not as violative of rights, but as insufficient to protect cause. At various times, Sisi faced criticism for reinstituting this law on the other side, that it would too much to violate rights. Either way, Copts have continued to suffer what Pope Tadaros has called a wave of persecution in recent years. Sisi has made symbolic gestures, as Mr. Bauer discussed, in recent years, calling for the unity and brotherhood of all Egyptians, attending a mass on Christmas, appointing a Coptic woman governor, as we discussed earlier. I do not view these actions as small or insignificant. Nonetheless, actual security from radicals would be far better than these symbolic gestures, which, while meaningful, are far insufficient to protect the lives or defend the rights of Copts in Egypt. The main cause of these attacks from all Muslim extremists is that they do not believe in Copts' legitimacy, in equality. They do not believe that they have the right to build churches or to even have house churches used for worship. Sisi has championed law 80-2016, which would allow for more building, but it's been criticized for having many loopholes. And while recent laws legalized house churches, there's still significant concern that these are not being enforced and the perpetrators are not being punished. One reason for this, is also previously mentioned, was the Orwellian system, reconciliation system, during which a period of reconciliation is called for. Copts forgo their legal rights and enter into to try to reconcile with their attackers. In the meantime, the church remains unrepaired and shut down. Essentially, the attackers get what they want for attacking it. This takes us back to Sisi and America. I believe that whatever his flaws, which are many and varied, both in his way of looking at the world and way of handling things, he nonetheless would prefer to do the right thing regarding Copts, at least insofar as it protects his other interests. But as non-Brotherhood radicals are not his immediate enemy, he's thus done far less to confront them, allowing them to go on persecuting Copts. His priority is beating his most immediate rival, the Muslim Brotherhood, and consolidate his rule and stay alive. In order to do this, he needs America's help. How much he sought after Trump's embrace alone is evidence of that fact. But there's far more. Egypt has been seeking closer and closer relationships with America across the board, government to government, person to person, military to military, you name it. A recent high-profile example is the second annual Bright Star exercises between the American military and the Egyptian military. These did not occur in the Obama administration, and the connections like this are highly sought by Sisi's administration. I think we should continue to seek close relationships with Sisi for a price. Here's a personal example, a person to person. A friend of mine, a Jewish friend, works for the American Sephardi Association, was traveling in North Africa. And he was asked while there to visit Egypt. He was on vacation. And Sisi reached out to Jewish groups and asked him to make a special trip to Egypt. Him and a few other American Jews were granted a personal audience with Sisi. This sort of extreme reaching out to Americans shows how badly he wants and needs Americans' approval. This gives people leverage over his government in order to change his policies and to change, more importantly, probably change his priorities when it comes to enforcing the law. Every congressman who meets with Sisi who brings up the plight of cops and makes some reasonable requests, such as severely modifying or ending the reconciliation process, or issuing more permits for cops to build churches, or to do more to protect cops from violence, is likely to be listened to. A host of such requests will likely be honored in at least some small way. And when I say small way, one thing I like to say is I'm not here to bring peace to the Middle East. I'm trying to minimize the damage. You don't want to think big, you want to think small. Any way people can influence a member of Congress, people inside the administration, or people to prioritize the interests of cops, or, as another panel said, to treat these issues seriously, and to bring it up whenever interacting with Sisi's government is likely to pay dividends. Requests on the parts of American cops will matter as well. The more we in America make ourselves heard, the more it will matter to Sisi. Sisi is not a saint, he is not a Jeffersonian Democrat. His commitment to Coptic interests will vary significantly based on how he's incentivized. He won't make fundamental changes, and he probably can't even if he wants to, in the short term. But his desire to be an American good graces gives significant ability for people who like us to ensure that his message gets across that if he desires closeness with America, he will pay attention to the plight of cops. That includes staring down radicalism of all stripes, and that is just the most immediate enemy of the Muslim Brotherhood. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Cliff. We're going to move into question and answer time now. We have about 15 minutes, so we don't have a wireless mic, so if you have a question, please raise your hand. I'll call on you.
To the podium or come to.
Oh yeah, you could come up to the podium. That's a great idea. If you come up to the podium, I would like to say, please keep your questions brief, not statements. And also, if you have a specific person you'd like to direct it to, make that clear. So if any of you have questions, please feel free to come up. And maybe I'll start off with a question while we're waiting if anyone wants to think about it. I think my question is directed to any of you who'd like to respond. But going back to this idea of the two narratives that we're hearing, basically, I want to know what your take is on this argument that from the Egyptian government that we've heard repeatedly, which is we need to deal with the foreign terrorists first, who are supposedly causing the persecution in Egypt, and then we'll deal with human rights and religious freedom later. In my personal belief, I don't think we've ever seen that work out, that somebody who denied human rights and religious freedom suddenly decided later to grant them. Coptic Solidarity has repeatedly said, and this would be the other narrative, the counter-narrative, that this discrimination is systematic, it's a daily discrimination. The foreign terrorist attacks and really aren't foreign. Most of those people who commit them are people from Egypt. That's a systematic discrimination. So what do you think about those two kind of counter-narratives, and also how best to move that dialogue on? Because these are the narratives that we hear the most up here on Capitol Hill, as well as with other governments, as well as our own government here in the United States.
Thank you. What I was trying to emphasize in my remarks was the interconnectedness between religious freedom, the rights of the Copts, and the broader human rights situation. And where I would fault President al-Sisi the most for his approach to the security situation and the other challenges in Egypt is that by having a wholesale policy of repression, he's in fact harming other aspects of society that he would perhaps wish to protect. So I don't think there's a way that he can improve the situation of the Copts, improve religious freedom, without paying attention to the broader human rights situation. Partly it's because the level of violence is just self-perpetuating, and you have state violence begets non-state violence and so forth. But also, you lose ground-up, grassroots pressure on the government to stop behaving arbitrarily, to uphold the rule of law, when you lose activity from a free press, from a free civil society. So without those kinds of basic political freedoms, the kind of organic societal change that is necessary to address deep-rooted discriminatory attitudes towards cops, for example, that is not going to be addressed. And it was being addressed 10 or 15 years ago. Now it is not being addressed, and that is a huge problem.
If I could just add a brief thought from the perspective of the Trump administration and all of this. I'm a presidential appointee to USERV, and the president was well aware of my strong feelings about religious liberty issues, including what's happening to Egyptian Christian Coptic community, which is one of the reasons he put me on the commission. I've been in Washington apparently since the 1800s. I've been in Washington a long time, and I've seen a lot of administrations deal with this issue, not just Coptic Christians, but the issue of how to balance the needs of American foreign policy with both national security concerns, but also with the suffering of minority religious communities. It's obviously not easy. If you want to lose sleep at night, and maybe some of you do anyway, but if you want to lose sleep at night, try to imagine what some of the likely headlines could be in the next 10 years out of the Middle East, any number of which would have incredible impact not only on religious minorities in the Middle East, but on the United States. I think while the Coptic Christian community has no obligation to feel satisfied with any American administration, I think nonetheless it's wise to consider all the things that are being balanced on a day-to-day basis. Say, everybody's commented that American presidents age a great deal when they're in office. One of the reasons they age is that American presidents begin each day, whether they're a Republican or a Democrat, being given an overnight report of what happened around the world that would impact the national security of the United States and what people did to counter those threats. Most Americans, thankfully, never read that report. If they did, we would all be aging much more rapidly than we already are. So I think this is an administration that cares very deeply about religious liberty, not only in the United States, but around the world. Whether it's the president, the vice president, Secretary Pompeo, former Senator Brownback, and certainly the members of USERV, both Republican appointees and presidential appointees and congressional appointees, Republican and Democrat. And on a day-to-day basis, it might not always be satisfying, but I think we have an administration that understands the need to push on this, and certainly the members of the commission and the commission overall will continue to do everything we can to help provide relief for the Coptic Christian community as well as other religious minorities that are being persecuted around the world.
Thank you. Did anybody else want to respond to that? No. Okay. Well, oh, you have a question, okay.
Last week when President Sisi said that we have to treat the Copts kindly because our religion teaches us this, which makes us like a zombie situation. We are not in a Khalifa state, we are a citizen of a state. For this reason, I think he has a mistake in thinking about the situation with the Copts, because we are not a dhimmi anymore.
A religious approach.
Well, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, you're not Coptic Christians are not a group begging for morsels off the table. You are Egyptian citizens, and you are due as a matter of Christians, the Coptic Christians are due as a result of their citizenship, all of the protections that the Egyptian government gives to anybody else in Egypt. And my hope would be that President Sisi would certainly eventually, if not now, understand that basic fact.
So I have another question for Mr. Fowler. Secretary Bombabo, he released 195 million last month, and this month he released 150. And in the letter that he released this money, he appreciates the CC human rights record in the letter. I don't know what is how this happened. How we appreciate, although regardless of the Copts. I mean, someone, the journalist, said that Egypt is like open air prison or something.
Yeah, sorry, I'm not, for anybody who didn't understand the question, he's asking about the money that Secretary Pompeo released to Egypt, the money that was withheld for human rights violations, and basically the reasoning, you know, what was the reasoning to release that aid when we haven't really seen improvements?
Any other questions? Well, I'm not privy to all those deliberations, but I would assume that what's being balanced in all of this, sometimes in ways that are not completely satisfactory to all of us, is that there's deep worry about other forces in the region. Iranian expansionism, the situation in Syria, and that Egypt is seen as a potential force for stability in the region, and a nation that could be helpful in accomplishing very important American foreign policy goals. So what Secretary Pompeo and the President and the Vice President are wrestling with on every one of these decisions is how do we remain loyal to our fundamental commitment to religious liberty, and at the same time not inadvertently cause a domestic situation in Egypt that would make matters even worse depending on unpredictable events. So, for example, not to put too fine a point on it, if God forbid something terrible happened to the current leadership of the Egyptian government and it was replaced by the Muslim Brotherhood, would things be better or worse for religious minorities in Egypt, including the Christian Coptic community? And I think that's got a fairly clear answer. The other side of that coin is the United States should push as hard as we can for progress without crossing that line. And perhaps we'll find out that there have been concessions made that won't be apparent until we see them. I certainly agree with everybody in this room that it's going too slow. It needs to go faster, not only for the sake of American foreign policy, but for the sake of the people of Egypt that should live in a country that recognizes more effectively the right of all human beings, all Egyptians, to worship in peace as they see fit.
To follow up on that question, what benchmarks should Congress be looking for, understanding that we do have a history of giving a lot of financial aid, as the question just kind of following up on that, what sort of benchmarks should they be looking for on the human rights side, saying we are giving this financial aid, this is an important part of the U.S.-Egyptian partnership, but on the human rights side, we want to be seeing these benchmarks met. over the years as we're continuing to give this security aid?
On this question of Secretary Pompeo releasing the funds and also on the conditionality, the letter I think you may have been referring to in the previous question, when Secretary Pompeo released the most recent set of funds, which I think is the FY 2017 package, he was required by Congress to send a report to Congress about human rights conditions in Egypt, which he did, which the State Department provided. And that provided a pretty accurate picture of a terrible human rights situation. So that was in a way ironic that Secretary Pompeo was releasing that most recent pot of funds and also the previous one without any critical reference to ongoing serious human rights and in fact a worsening human rights situation. And that sent a broader message, I think, which certainly the Egyptian government took it as a message, that its human rights performance was no longer of great importance to the Trump administration. And that, I think, and that includes religious freedom. And I don't think it's possible to say we care about religious freedom, but the rest of it we're not going to even raise when we have a public opportunity and a public obligation to do so, when Congress has demanded that the administration should do this. So the way in which the funds were released was particularly dismissive, I think, of the human rights conditions more broadly, including religious freedom situation in Egypt. So one thing that the US government should do is, and the administration particularly should do, when Congress stipulates human rights conditions on aid, then the administration should take that into consideration. It shouldn't just dismiss it arbitrarily as Secretary Pompeo just did, which is why we are now, and more broadly in the human rights community as well, are advocating that Congress not only increases the proportion of the funds which are conditioned by a range of human rights conditions, but also it should look at the waiver. The way that the Secretary is able to release these funds without paying attention to human rights conditions is that there is a national security waiver included in the legislation. If that waiver wasn't there, if that discretion was not given to the administration, and arguably the administration, if it's not going to pay attention to the concerns expressed by Congress, then why should Congress continue to extend that kind of latitude to the administration? So it's within Congress's power to toughen the human rights conditionality, and we certainly think, given the negative trend in human rights conditions generally in Egypt, it should do so.
I would like to answer your question, just specifically focus on the Copts. I completely 100% agree on the human rights, and I do not think we should or can separate the issues. But few things that could happen tomorrow if they wanted to, the political will existed, is one, the application of the rule of law on those mob violence and the abandoning of the reconciliation councils. Two is a more reasonable church law where at least you can say it is somewhat equal to building a mosque. Three would be, and this is going to be harder, but I think also it's realistic, is the treating of the law between Copts and Muslims should be the same. And there is several instances where the treatment is different. The most obvious example is something actually that our State Department has released. If a Christian wanted to convert to Islam, he would go and the government will issue him an ID with no problems. If it was the other way around, they would refuse to issue him an ID. So there's no reasonable reason why you should apply different laws to your own citizens.
For those that want to get into the details of it, USERF publishes an annual report, and we outline a group of recommendations that we are urging the Trump administration to pursue related to Egypt. We mentioned some of them, the need to stop the teaching of hate in the schools of Egypt and in the curriculum of Egypt, to actually enforce the 2016 law so that churches can be built and additions can be made and registrations can be done in a way that the Coptic Christian community will have a place to worship. But there's many other recommendations in the USERF report, and I would commend it to you since we don't have time this afternoon to go through each item.
Thank you. I think we're going to take one last question over here, and then we'll wrap up.
Actually, I have a question and also it's a message. As an activist, we have an issue with our Coptic church. First, the church and most of our leaders, they have like close connections with the Egyptian government. Another thing, the Egyptian government and the security agencies, they control them, and sometimes they even recruit them in different ways. So the issue is, and it's really affecting us as an activist, and affecting our, even, nobody even, sometimes they don't believe us, or they think, no, the issue is not serious, no persecution in Egypt. Like, most of them, they keep denying. Everybody here knows, everywhere, Christians are persecuted everywhere. It's a fact. Nobody can even deny it or claim. The churches keep promoting to the idea that nobody is persecuted, no more persecution in Egypt. And even they came here last week, and even the Coptic leader himself, he came here himself in a visit which is politically motivated. He's here for the promotion. He's trying like to pave the way for Abdel Fattah al-Sisi to come here. He's trying to gather people to go even just to welcome Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. I'm denying it, even we have no issue in Egypt, Christians are happy, and it doesn't happen. What I'm trying to say is that affecting us. Nobody is like, nobody want to believe us. Even the Egyptian, the American government, when the officials go to Egypt, the first thing to do, they meet our religious leaders, and most of them, they deny that we are persecuted. They keep saying, no more persecution, nothing is happening, everything is okay, and no, we have serious issue.
Thank you for that.
My question is, how can we deal with that?
Can I just reiterate real quickly for the
everybody.
people on the live feed, because they can't hear that? I'll simplify it real quickly. The question from one of our guests who's a Coptic activist, is basically saying, what can we do about the Egyptian church, which is under incredible pressure? So Pope Tadros, who's been in the United States on his 6-week visit, who has made efforts to mobilize Copts to greet President Sisi at the UN General Assembly in New York, as well as other leaders in the Coptic Church who have made statements making it sound like there's not persecution in Egypt. And that it is somewhat of an internal issue, but it really harms efforts for organizations and for activists such as yourself who are trying to talk about what's happening. And I think, just as you guys answer this question, one thing that we all should remember is that when we hear from a religious leader who is under that type of government, they're under incredible pressure and they don't want to do anything that could cause harm. And that's why it's important to have independent voices and to always remember that when we meet, we speak with a leader in a country such as Egypt.
So, I would like to take a different perspective for your question. Anybody, me, you, anybody in here, has the right and possibility to express a political opinion, including people in the church. The problem is not in them expressing a political opinion. The problem is me, you, and our community as a whole taking that political opinion more than a political opinion of one person. If Donald Trump comes in and gives a sermon and explaining a passage from the Bible, no one would really listen to him. Okay, with all due respect to him. But he's not a religious leader, he's a political leader. In the same way, when a religious leader comes to you and gives you advice on your retirement account, you wouldn't listen to it. In the very same way, we as a community should speak up, and that takes time. And when everybody speaks up, and when us as a collective voice have a message to say, then people will listen. And I don't want you to worry too much about congressmen or congresswomen or senators or whoever goes to Egypt and talk to the clergy. They're not stupid. They know very well what has to be said and what should be said, and they have a full picture. So everybody can say whatever they want. Like I said, we all coming from different values. 10 years ago, if I was in Egypt right now, my thought, my ideology would be different than my thoughts and ideology when I'm here.
Yeah. It actually reminds me of something I just recently read on a, again, tangentially related topic, only tangentially. I read The Case for Democracy by Natan Sharansky. He talked a lot about his time in Russia, which admittedly was far, far worse, but he talked about the difference between a free society and a fair society, and he talked about double thinking, where people would have sort of an official thing they would say, something they, on one level, would almost kind of think in a certain sense, but if you really got them alone and got them in a place where they knew they were safe, they would say something different. Obviously, I don't think Egypt is quite Soviet Russia, but fundamentally, in the current situation, the sad truth is, I think it remains a fair society. It's one where people can't always speak their mind openly, and where they can't really tell the truth without severe consequences for them. So, I don't think the issue is necessarily, as he alluded to, that you need to necessarily criticize religious leaders in Egypt for what they say, given the situation they're in. I think is what's important is to get people to understand that this is the difference between, as I mentioned, a fair society and an open society, and to realize that people are not going to always give their straightforward position under these current circumstances, to tell that truth and let people evaluate what they say in light of that. When people understand that, they can cite this, they can filter the information accordingly and hopefully come to the right conclusions about what can and needs to be done.
Okay, well, thank you so much to all of our guest speakers. Thank you to everyone who watched online and to all of you who joined us. We really appreciate you supporting Coptic Martyrs and also continuing to work with us for Coptic equality. Thank you.